Subject: on the symbolic architecture of the leaping bunny mark. Dear Ms. Leary, I write to you as an independent researcher who works at the intersection of information operations, symbolic systems, and nonviolence ethics, and as someone who has followed the anti-vivisection and cruelty-free movement from many years from the outside. First, a brief acknowledgement. I am fully aware that you have devoted decades of your life to the American Anti-Vivisection Society, to the Alternatives Research and Development Foundation, and to chairing the Coalition for Consumer Information on Cosmetics CCIC and its Leaping Bunny program. In the historical scale of things, this is not a trivial contribution. It is entirely possible that many lives, human and non-human, have been spared suffering because of that work, precisely because of the seriousness of this legacy. I feel compelled to address an aspect which is almost always dismissed as a mere detail, namely, the symbolic and semiotic architecture of the movement, and in particular the Leaping Bunny logo itself. To be clear, my concern is not about the rabbit. The rabbit is a painfully obvious and appropriate emblem for a movement opposing animal testing. My concern is about the coupling of that rabbit with a pair of 5-pointed stars. From a strictly historical and semiotic standpoint, the 5-pointed star is not a neutral, innocent ornament. Over roughly the last century, it has been systematically tied to some of the most violent and coercive systems on this planet: revolutionary and totalitarian politics, military structures, and the whole spectrum of occult and ritual symbol systems in which pain, sacrifice, and domination are central themes. One may argue that in yet earlier epochs it had protective or harmonious meanings. But protection for whom, and at whose expense, is not a trivial question. What troubles me is the following combination: the primary victim species of the vivisection and cosmetics industry, the rabbit, encircled and framed by a geometry that, in the lived historical memory of the last 100 years, has been stamped onto mass violence, repression, and ideological conquest. And this combination then replicated, quite literally, on millions of packages and screens. As the ethical SIGNIFIE. I am aware that most people inside the movement will shrug and say, it is just a tiny star. The science and audits are what matters. I am also aware that the majority of people who do sense something deeply off in this geometry do not have the language or credibility to raise it without being pathologized. For that reason, I want to be very explicit. I am not accusing you, nor CCIC, of any conscious occult program or conspiracy. What I am saying is that, in an era where symbols are repeated at digital scale and where semiotics functions as a quiet form of power, it is intellectually and ethically irresponsible to pretend that the choice of such a heavily loaded geometry is irrelevant, especially in a movement whose whole moral legitimacy rests on opposing cruelty, domination, and the reduction of living beings to symbols and objects. There are 3 points I would respectfully ask you to consider. 1. The near-total absence of a transparent logo origin narrative. In many ethical or mission-driven organizations, the story of the emblem is told, sometimes even mythologized, precisely because it is meant to embody the values of the movement. In the case of the Leaping Bunny, we know a great deal about the audit standard, the coalition, and the policy work, but essentially nothing about who designed the logo, why the stars were added, and what was discussed at the time. With a symbol this widespread, that silence becomes a signal in itself. 2. The dissonance between purpose and geometry. If one were to design, from first principles, a sign for the abolition of ritualized and industrialized violence against sentient beings, it would be entirely possible to choose a visual language grounded in organic forms: leaf, paw print, sun, tree, simple circle, even the unadorned animal itself. The decision to anchor such a movement instead in a geometry that has been imprinted onto flags, armies, and occult systems does not have to be malicious to be profoundly unwise. 3. The existence of a much older ethical lineage. Long before modern NGOs and certification schemes, thinkers such as Abu al-Malik and others argued, in painfully clear language, for abstaining from eating animals and from participating in violence against them. 1 to 3. When one reads those texts, it is immediately obvious that their ethics are not about branding, but about a very old and very hard law of mercy. Against that backdrop, a rabbit wrapped in 5 pointed stars feels less like progress and more like an unresolved collision between two value systems. I do not expect you to agree with all of this. I do not expect an instant redesign of the logo, but I do think that, in the long run, a movement which claims the moral authority to speak for the most vulnerable sentient beings on the planet cannot afford to be careless or incurious about the symbolic apparatus under which it marches. At the very minimum, there should be an honest internal audit of the symbolics used by AAVS, CCIC, and the Leaping Bunny program. A willingness to hear from people for whom these forms are not neutral abstractions but carry the weight of historical violence and domination, and an openness to evolve the visual language of the movement in a direction that is more consonant with its stated telos, the abolition, not the cosmetic masking, of cruelty. If any of this warrants further discussion at a more technical level, semiotic, historical, or strategic, I would be willing, within my limited means, to contribute analysis or simply to provide an outsider's map of how these symbols operate in the wider information environment. With respect for the work you have already done, and with an equally uncompromising loyalty to those who cannot write letters at all, Margus Migo, independent researcher in information operations, symbolic systems, and nonviolence ethics student of the older law of mercy towards sentient beings. References for context. Not as an academic demand. 1 Mark. Abu al-Allah, on abstinence from animal food, on abstinence from eating animals. Various translations. 2. Humanistic texts, selections from Elmark on abstaining from animal products and opposing cruelty. 3. Historical overviews of pre-modern abstinence, proto-vegan thought. Cf. Wikipedia entry on abstinence from eating animals and related sources. 4. Early and modern vegan organizations, including the Vegan Society UK. For context on how the ethical argument predates 20th century branding. *** subject. Symbolic audit questions regarding the Leaping Bunny mark. Dear Mr. Klein, I am writing to you in your capacity as president of the American Anti-Vivisection Society and the Alternatives Research and Development Foundation, and as the current chair of the Coalition for Consumer Information on Cosmetics, CCIC, and its Leaping Bunny program. I am an independent researcher working on information operations, symbolic systems, and nonviolence ethics. My interest in your work is not academic curiosity alone. I consider the struggle against ritualized and industrialized cruelty to sentient beings to be one of the few truly non-negotiable fronts of civilization. From the outside, the institutional trajectory that you have inherited is remarkable. AAVS is one of the oldest anti-vivisection societies in the world. ARDF funding alternatives, CCIC and cruelty-free international building a transnational audit standard where cruelty-free is not merely a marketing slogan, but a documented supply chain claim. I do not deny this achievement, however, precisely because your generation is now taking over this apparatus. There is a responsibility to examine not only the scientific and regulatory layers, but also the symbolic and semiotic layer that has quietly grown round the movement, especially in an era where symbols are multiplied endlessly on screens and packaging. In particular, I am concerned with the leaping bunny logo as it is currently used, the combination of a rabbit, archetypal victim of the very practices your organizations oppose, and a pair of 5-pointed stars framing that rabbit, raises a number of questions which, in my view, have never been adequately addressed historically. The 5-pointed star is not a harmless decoration. It has been used, repeatedly and systematically, as a signifier for military power, revolutionary and totalitarian projects, and a wide family of occult and ritual systems in which pain, sacrifice, and hierarchy are central. Whether one interprets this from a purely historical perspective or from a more esoteric one, it is at least clear that we are not dealing with an empty geometry. It is one thing for such a symbol to appear on state flags and uniforms. It is another for it to be welded, almost casually, to the emblem of a movement that claims to represent mercy and abstention from cruelty. I am aware that, inside institutions, there is a strong bias to treat these concerns as symbolic overinterpretation, a distraction from the real work of audits, laws, and lab alternatives. I would argue the opposite. In a world where entire populations live immersed in symbols, branding, and interfaces, the mere geometry of a sign is part of the real work. It shapes how people feel about the movement long before they read a single policy document. To put it bluntly, if the anti-vivisection and cruelty-free movement allows its primary global mark to be encoded in a geometry that carries a century of associations with conquest, mass violence, and occult power, then it is handing over part of its moral terrain without a fight. I do not claim to know the internal history of TH.